Welcome grade 7. In this video, we are going to be taking a look at percent increase. And today we're going to be taking a look at percent increase. In the next video, we're going to take a look at something very similar, percent decrease. So let's say, for example, that you are getting better at TypingPal. And someone tells you that you had a 20% increase in the amount of words that you could now type. Or you typed a lot more words and you want to figure out what is the percentage that you got better at TypingPal. Well, that's what we're going to figure out here. So to calculate a percentage increase, we have to know a couple of things. We have to know the increase in value of a quantity from its original value. So let's say you used to be able to type 20 words a minute. You now have an increased value of maybe your increased value, now you can do 30 words a minute. And so in order to be able to figure out the increase, we take your increased value minus your original value, and then we can also use that to figure out the percentage increase. So as we've said before, if you want to figure out how much you have increased, what we do is you take your increase value. For our example, maybe that's now you can type, your increased value is 30 words per minute, and you subtract the original value. In our example, maybe you were able to type 20 words a minute. Now you can type 30. So 30 minus 20 means that you saw an increase of 10 words per minute. We can also use this information to figure out a percentage increase. And percentage increase, we are going to take the same sort of thing. We're going to take the increase here, which we could have figured out from using this formula. So you increased by 10 words per minute, divide that by the original value, and then times that by 100% to get it as a percentage. So in the example that we gave, you can now type 30 words a minute. You used to be able to type 20, so that's an increase of 10 words per minute. 10 divided by the original, which is 20, times by 100 means that you saw a 50% increase now that you can type 30 words per minute. Let's take a look at a couple of examples as we step through. If you feel like you understand it really well, you can skip ahead on these examples and just go right to the questions, or you can take a look at the examples in the textbook as well. Or if you'd like to hear more of an explanation, you can continue in on this video. If you're following along on the questions that are there, we're going to take a look at example 9, 10, and 11 as we step through percentage increase. Example number 9 says, David's monthly salary increased from $3,600 to $3,900. Find the percentage increase in his salary. Okay, so we have a couple of bits of information here. We need to figure out percentage increase. To do that, we first need to figure out increase, which we don't have yet. We have the increased value, and that is that he is now making, so to figure out increase, which is what we don't know yet, we know his increased value. That's what he's making right now, which is $3,900. And we subtract that from his original value, what he used to make, which was $3,600. We're able to now find out that that's an increase of 300 bucks. Now that we know the increase, we can figure out the percentage increase. I'm just going to short form that to PI. And to do that, we have increase divided by original value times 100%. Increase we just figured out is 300 bucks divided by the original value, which was $3,600 times 100%. We're going to have to do some rounding here, but that gives us a percentage increase of about 8.3%. Now that 3 continues on and on and on if you were to actually divide these, but we'll round that off and say it's about 8.3%. So what that means is David's monthly salary increased by 8.3%. All right, let's take a look at another one here. Let's take a look at example number 10. If you're still following along. Example number 10 says, last week, 8,000 copies of a certain magazine were sold. This week, 7% more copies were sold. How many copies of the magazine were sold this week? So now we are looking to figure out a number as opposed to figuring out a percent. Last week, 8,000 copies of a certain magazine were sold. So that's the original value that we know. Original value is 8,000. We know that this week 7% more copies. So our percent increase is 7%. And now what we have to figure out is how many copies were sold. We have to figure out the increased value. Or sorry, the increased value. And we do that by first figuring out the increase. So there's a lot of different ways, or there's two different ways that we could go about figuring this out. One of the ways is by using one of our original formulas in order to solve or to figure out some of these bits of information. So our first formula, or our second formula here, we can still use that. We know two of those bits of information. There's only one that's missing. So we know the percent increase. We know the original value. We just don't know the increase amount here. And so that's part of what we're going to be trying to figure out. And if I rearrange that formula, I get a new one that says increase equals original value times percent increase. I'll have to turn that percent increase into a decimal, but that means that we're taking 8,000, we multiply it by 7% as a decimal is 0.07. Remember that to figure that out, we take the number and divide it by 100, or we move the decimal 2 spots over. So that would give us an increase of 560 copies. Now that's great, but we are trying to figure out the increase value. So we know the original value. We know it increased by $560 or 560 magazines. And so my increased value is just going to equal my original value, in this case, 8,000 copies, plus whatever it increased by, my increase, which in this case is 560, which would mean that the following week, after a 7% increase, there is now 8,560 different magazines that are there. This is one of the ways that you could go about solving this particular question. There's actually a second way that we could do it as well, that might even skip a step here. So this one, we did it in 2 steps. We figured out the increase, and then we added that on to figure out what the rest was. But can we combine these steps? Well, we actually can. And so I can figure out the increased amount by saying, okay, well, if this is the original value and it increased by 7%, then to figure out the new value, it's going to be whatever the original value is, 100% of the original value plus the 7% increase. So what that means is the new price, or the new amount of magazines, is going to be 107% of the original value. Now, the word of is a special word in math that means times. So we're going to take 107%, turn that into a decimal, 1.07, and multiply that by the original value, 8,000. And what you'll notice is you'll end up with the exact same answer, 8,560 copies. So that's a little bit of a method 2 if you want to think about it that way. And what we did here to kind of simplify things is we figured out that increased value equals 100% plus the increase percent times the original value. That's giving a formula to what we just ended up solving or figuring out. Let's take a look at one last example here to see if we can better understand how we can deal with this increase, and particularly these percent increase. If you're following along, the final one that we're going to take a look at here is going to be example number 11. Example number 11 says the height of a plant at the end of a month is 26 inches. So at the end of the month, this is meaning that this is our increase value is going to be 26 inches. If its height has increased by 30%, so our percent increase is 30% since the beginning of the month, find its height at the beginning of the month. So this time around, in our first example, we figured out percent increase. In our second example, we figured out increase and increase value. Now we're asked to figure out the original value. And so we're going to use a similar formula here. In order to figure out what our original value is going to be, we're going to move certain things around. We're going to use actually the same formula that we just created here. We're going to have to rearrange some things, but we're going to start off with that formula. And that is that an increased value equals 100% plus the percent increase, I'm just going to put PI for short, times the original. So we know increased value, it's 26. We know this is going to be 100% plus the percent increase, which is 30%. What we don't know is the original. That's what we're going to have to solve. So we're now at 26 equals 130% times the original. And percent we always want to work with as a decimal, so let's convert that. 26 equals 1.3 times the original. Now I want to get the original by itself. We're going back to some of our algebra days in figuring out how to get the original by itself. Right now, I'm multiplying 1.3. So if you remember back to our last unit, our way of moving things around in equations is to use opposite operations. The opposite of times 1.3 would be divided by 1.3. And if you remember, 1.3 divided by 1.3 is just 1, and 1 times any number is just going to be that number. So those end up canceling out. But I can't just change this side without affecting this side. So I have to divide this by 1.3 as well. That allows me to get the original, that value by itself. And on this side, all I have left is 26 divided by 1.3, which if you were to plug that into your calculator, you'd figure out that gives you an answer or a result of 20. What that means, if we bring it back to the question, is that the plant's height at the beginning of the month was 20 inches. And then after a 30% increase, by the end of the month, it ended up being 26 inches tall. Hopefully that makes sense as we work through percent increase. In our next video, we'll take a look at percent decrease.